usually you can't see me do this because I got my podium in front of me. But I read it because that's the only way I can keep it short. Thank y'all for coming to the first portable Noon Debrief, not in its usual location. I'm Brad Wortham. I want to thank y'all for taking the trouble to be here. How can y'all hear me? Can y'all hear me okay without it?
No.
Okay. Anyway. All right. Well, he's a louder talker than I am, so. These programs are usually held at the South Carolina Confederate Railroad Room and Military Museum. That's a museum that is dedicated to preserving and teaching about the experiences of South Carolinians in military history of our nation. And recently, the museum, well, a year and a half ago, the museum opened a very large new exhibit covering the Vietnam era, and it's all about the experiences of South Carolinians in Vietnam. Well, a portion of that is a place of honor that's reserved to honoring the Americans who were POWs in North Vietnam at what is ironically called the Hanoi Hilton. This is a lot of our programs recently, these Noon Debrief programs, have been about Vietnam, frequently featuring veterans and other times academics talking about it. The museum's temporarily closed to accommodate some renovations that are going on for the next couple of months. So we're taking this program on the road. I see about half the crowd here today has been to them plenty of times before. I appreciate y'all coming to this new location. I think the library folks put up all this construction stuff to make the relic room people feel at home. So, Joe Long is the museum's curator of education. He is here to talk about a subject that occupies a place of honor in that new Vietnam exhibit, the American servicemen who were held for years in the prison called the Hanoi Hilton. I just said that. We've all heard about the ordeal experienced there by the late John McCain. Some of us know about the good neighbor we recently lost here in Columbia, Jack Van Loan. Joe will broaden your knowledge about what the men confined and tortured in Hanoi went through. I've never heard a lecture delivered by Joe that wasn't fascinating. Please welcome Joe. He might not need that.
He's never come to one of my lectures before. Folks, thank you very much for coming here today. And I'm going to do my best here. I'm looking out at a room of people that know, in most of you, a good deal more about Vietnam than I do or ever will. And it's been a humbling experience as a military historian who usually works with things that happened at least a century back, to be around so many of our veterans from that terrible, terrible conflict. And one of the lessons is you meet somebody of a certain demographic, and on sight, you absolutely do not know what that person has achieved, endured, and been through. And I got a feeling, and certain knowledge in some cases, that's very true in this room. So I'm going to ask for a little grace here as I attempt to tell a story. Preserving the stories and drawing the lessons is part of what we do. It's maybe the biggest thing we do to honor the past. The past is controversial often in stupid ways today. And I think something that everybody back there, if we could talk to them, would agree on is they want us to learn. They want us to pay attention and learn the lessons. So I'm going to be bold enough to try and draw a few lessons. And if anybody at the end wants to stand up and correct me from superior life experience, I'll take that. That's not a problem. I will quote my pedigree for a moment. Those of you in the war, those of you who are veterans of the Vietnam War, I tell vets, I hope you never met my parents, because my parents only met casualties. They were both Army medical personnel assigned to the same hospital. That is how a Western New York girl and a South Georgia boy got together, resulting in me. So, the Hanoi Hilton, American servicemen's ironic humor, using the name of the luxury hotel chain to refer to this place of captivity. A little background on POWs and the development of how prisoners of war have been treated over the years, and the mentality. If you go back to ancient times, what you get are very ugly stories. Those who surrendered were slaughtered or enslaved, or in some cases maimed in order to never be able to fight again, and then sent back on the population. The brutality of the ancient world was ferocious. Fast forwarding to the Middle Ages, a knight faced a different sort of captivity than a lower ranking person, a lower socially ranking person, and he faced that part different captivity partly because of a shared code among knights, and partly because he was a valuable hostage. And when we say a valuable hostage in this case, he's often given reasonable house arrest, living arrangements, and considerable courtesy. But the amount of money extorted from his rich family to get him back is very high. Fast forwarding once more. In the American Revolution, this is an unbelievable statistic to me. In the American Revolution, on our side, the Patriots' side, we had approximately 4,435 men who died in battle. 4,500 men. We had 11,000 men who died in captivity on the ships that the British used as POW camps, called prison hulks. On the USS, the HMS New Jersey alone, thousands died, more than perhaps died on all of the battlefields on our side. By the 1860s, things are evolving, but they were struggling with the logistics of how do you care for so many captives. Also, there was not a clear directive. So POWs were held to reduce the enemy's manpower, and they were held for, hopefully, eventual exchange. And that's a history story in itself, but I can't help mentioning some things I read about the Hanoi Hilton are not totally unfamiliar from experiences I've read of a Union captive held in downtown Columbia. An amateur poet who took much the same attitude to raise morale and look out for his comrades that we see among the Hanoi Hilton survivors. Of course, he faced nothing like the brutality, and in its months of operation, a few blocks away on Bull Street, a prison camp for officers here in Columbia had only one death among the 800 inmates. You still didn't want to go there. The 20th century brought dark things in many cases. The First World War, conventions were followed. In the Second World War, you began to see, well, captivity by the Japanese was an entirely different concept than being captured by the Germans. Thousands of German POWs were held right here in South Carolina. They received humane treatment, Red Cross packages, military funerals if they passed away in captivity. And a surprising number of them used all the resources they had after a return to Germany to move back to South Carolina and settle after the war. That was their impression. We have items at the museums from a South Carolinian held in German captivity. But something was going on in the Eastern Front, and that was new communist paradigms. In World War II, the science of interrogation was more or less perfected as far as how do we get military information out of the captives. And it may not be what you think. You get military information out of the captives by treating them decently and getting them to converse about anything over a period of time and develop a relationship with the interrogator, who is soon seen as somebody who's basically a decent guy who can deliver some favors, and most of what the captive tells, they don't ever realize they've told. That's not what communists were after. When communists took prisoners, the Marxist theory said, okay, we're going to do these guys a favor by reshaping them into good communists. And this was done through the application of physical and psychological torture, and a process that became referred to as brainwashing. The Korean War. The Korean War, a disaster for the United States in a number of ways. Although we did fight the enemy to a standstill, South Korea remained free. But one of the worst stories that came home in Korea, there were 7,190 American captives, more or less, POWs. 38% of those, 4 out of 10, would die in captivity, compared to 11% in World War II. And that's conflating the Japanese and German systems, which were radically different. There were no escapes. There were no successful escapes from Korean War prison camps. At the end of that conflict, 21 collaborators with the communist captors refused to come home. They remained in North Korea. 192 who did come home were charged with serious offenses in collaborating with the enemy. The Department of Defense would estimate that over 70% of American POWs in Korea cooperated with their captors to some degree or another. Now, this is not giving any grace for men who did something because they were beaten into doing it. This is just a cold, dry, hard statistic that the Department of Defense put through. 70% cooperated to some extent, but they estimated that over 30% they considered to be collaborators. A much, much stronger term. In the early part of that war, 70% of New York Times, a former newspaper, New York Times stories related to the communist mistreatment of the prisoners. If they talk about POWs, 70% of the stories were about mistreatment. By the end of the conflict, 76% of their stories were about Americans being turncoats. This shows an effective psychological campaign, because part of the target was the other guy's media. If the other guy's media is saying, your prisoners of war, our prisoners of war, are changing their mind and deciding the other side was right, and they're not given the backstory of how these confessions and so forth are obtained, that is a win in the media fight. And the military is totally not ready for this kind of thing, not consistent in responses. Major General Dean of the U.S. Army would receive the Medal of Honor despite signing 2 confessions useful for propaganda. Now, I'm not saying he shouldn't have, not at all, but I'm pointing out that the military didn't know how to respond because Colonel Schwabel, U.S. Marine Corps, was court-martialed for signing one. So the military did not know how to respond to breakdowns under severe abuse and manipulation. And they set their minds to how we're going to deal with this from now on. The result was the Code of the American Fighting Man. This is something that Eisenhower signed off on. It was put down through the president, and a president vastly respected as the supreme commander in World War II. Now, quick show of hands, who here at some point in their lives, and I won't be asking you to recite it, but at some point had to memorize the Code of Conduct? Come on, I know there's a couple more than that. Yeah. So this is a memorized thing today, right now over at Fort Jackson. Young recruits are learning the current version of the code. This is the version of the code that was current as we got involved in the Vietnam War. 1. I am an American fighting man. I serve in the forces which guard my country and our way of life. I am prepared to give my life in their defense. 2. I will never surrender of my own free will. If in command, I will never surrender my men while they still have the means to resist. Number 3. If captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. I will make every effort to escape and aid others to escape. I will accept neither parole nor special favors from the enemy. That Article 3 is going to be central to a lot of conflicts and ethical dilemmas inside the Hanoi Hilton. What are all means available? What is every effort to escape and aid others to escape? What are parole or special favors? 4, if I become a prisoner of war, I will keep faith with my fellow prisoners. I will give no information or take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades. If I am senior, I will take command. If not, I will obey the lawful orders of those appointed over me and will back them up in every way. When questioned, Article 5, should I become a prisoner of war, I am bound to give only, they call this the Big Four, name, rank, service number, and date of birth. I will evade answering further questions to the best of my ability. I will make no oral or written statements disloyal to my country and its allies or harmful to their cause. I will never forget that I am an American fighting man, responsible for my actions and dedicated to the principles which made my country free. I will trust in my God and in the United States of America. This was the code, and it was formal. Now, the cast of characters in the conflict inside the Hanoi Hilton, and that's how I'm going to look at it today, as a conflict. It was a field of battle. And the Americans at the Hanoi Hilton are disproportionately fighter pilots. Now, sadly perhaps, that doesn't have the same ring, the same implications to every child today that it had to every child in my grade school. And I would hazard to guess every child 10 or 20 years earlier, those who would grow up to fly and fight in the war. But the great aces, the fighter pilots, ever since World War I, and men like Eddie Rickenbacker or the Red Baron on the other side, fighter pilots were sort of military celebrities. They were the knights of the sky. They were heroes whose names and units were remembered. American boys knew Eddie Rickenbacker and Richard Bong. They knew the Lafayette Escadrille. They knew the Flying Tigers. They certainly knew the demonstration team, the Blue Angels. Expensive equipment, and the United States made a decision which it shocked me when I learned other powers in World War II weren't this way. We considered pilot to be a commissioned officer job. It was within the last decade I realized, oh wait a minute, the Brits are having planes flown by enlisted men, so are the Germans, so are the Japanese. We're the only ones. But it wasn't a social status, as well as these are highly fit, highly educated, highly motivated, and think what makes a superhero? They can fly. In so many ways, fighter pilots were emblematic. This is sort of the Captain America vibe in a sense for the younger generation, whose heroes tend to be fictional these days. Because of this very reason, these guys are a strong, strong target for psychological warfare, to be made into propaganda assets by the enemy. This is part of, I think, the ferocious focus and the operation that is launched against them in the prison to try to use these men for propaganda purposes. A former actual Blue Angel pilot will be among the POWs. So will an ace from the Korean War. An ace had shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. Larry Guarino was a World War II veteran. Jeremiah Denton and James Stockdale, names that are well known to those who study the Hanoi Hilton at all, and would both have prominent careers afterwards. These guys were Naval Academy classmates, along with Jimmy Carter. So we're talking about an elite in more than one sense. Elite in their training and in their abilities, but there's also a social elite level here. Poor Brad is going to try to keep up with me and the slides that he has helpfully prepared when we tear down the plywood curtain once more, and you can come to the Confederate Relic Room to see our exhibits. These are some items that we actually have on display. The uniform on the left is from James Stockdale. The prisoner of war uniform, now few kept those. That was not a beloved thing, was it? The clown suit, it had been nicknamed for the striped trousers, but that one belonged to J. Quincy Collins, whose name will come up a little bit later as well. But now we have the conflict set up. And I hope this won't feel like trivializing it. I actually expected maybe I'd be talking to some teenagers and have to pull them in. Sir, in the back, thank you. Any comic book fan, any fan of the superhero genre, there's going to be this storyline sooner or later. My favorite guy loses his powers for some reason. What is he made of? What can he still do when he no longer has the flying and the super healing and the laser eyeballs and the super strength? When he doesn't have those things, what is he made of? Is he still a hero? Do heroes still have to have the super abilities? Do you see where I'm going with this? Everything that every apparent advantage was taken away from a shot down fighter pilot who landed somewhere in enemy territory. And a frequent characteristic of these stories, an element common to many of the Hanoi Hilton stories, is the debilitating wound suffered in the course of the parachute landing in the jungle or in the village. So you've got a helpless, wounded man who used to command these supersonic machines with tremendous firepower, and now is utterly stranded and alone. That's going to test character in ferocious ways, especially when it becomes clear how ruthless the enemy is going to be in pursuit of his goals. Excuse me for juggling papers for a minute. This is not a bad idea. There are so many great first-hand accounts that it feels silly to be talking about guys who could be speaking for themselves, and a little pretentious as well. And I am, here we go, thank goodness. This account was sent to me by a Facebook friend's husband, U.S. Marine Jim Warner, who, when we were planning this session, it was going to be one of the Homeschool Fridays for kids, and I found that things that are aimed at younger audiences are actually excellent for all of us. I've reached the point in my life where I will check out picture books about history that I'm studying without shame. But I think Jim wrote for general audiences here. I arrived in Vietnam in early March 1967. I was assigned to Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 323, flying the F-4 Phantom fighter bomber. Shot down on Friday the 13th of October 1967. It took us several weeks to get to Hanoi. I had to carry my pilot because he didn't do a parachute landing fall. That's a PLF, you roll out of the fall, and broke his ankle. We arrived at the prison known as the Hanoi Hilton in mid-November. The truck backed up to the prison. I looked at the green door and wondered what was going to happen to me on the other side. After we were taken in, 4 of us were put in a cell. We had been there a few days when we heard a man crying in pain. While we were living together, one of the Air Force pilots, Leon Ellis, told me about his best friend in flight training, named Lance Sejon. We did not know at the time. The man whose pain cries we heard was Lance Sejon, being tortured to death. The helplessness of the situation is hard to imagine, hard to comprehend. To have had so many resources in the struggle and then to be at the mercy of people that hate you. But they were not simply people who hated the prisoners of war. That was actually sometimes a feature of getting to the prison. Angry mobs attacking the downed aviator, often with the collaboration of a political officer, you know, one of those communist things, assigned to the party. He's going to stop in the different villages and permit the abuse of the prisoner. And by the way, this is a communist society. If you are not outraged and hateful toward the prisoner, there's a political officer standing right there. You better fake it because you don't want to attract the negative attention. But inside the prison itself, it's going to be a contest between a group of North Vietnamese Army personnel who have a mission. And their mission is to break these men for propaganda purposes and turn them into a media asset. You know, militaries have had a media strategy forever. It hasn't always been a very conscious thing, but it's always an aspect. It's always an aspect of the fight. And especially the Marxist revolutionary paradigm, which recognizes Well, most historians would say today that North Vietnam won the war in the American media. They certainly didn't on the battlefield. The Tet Offensive, so remembered as a huge turning point in the war, if you dig a little deeper, in every traditional metric of who won the battle, we kicked their sorry tails. But what happened in the media, that was more important. Clausewitz, the great Western theorist of war, Clausewitz said the true target of war is the enemy's will to fight. The national will. When they are no longer willing to fight and they stop, you won. We've used this. George Washington wore them out whipping us. He got up every time he was knocked down. He put the army back together every time it was broken up. And eventually it just became too tiresome to do it again. So the media strategy is going to be vital, and their intention is to make these men an asset in that aspect of their strategy. The American prisoners and chain of command have the mission to frustrate that. And the watchword becomes return with honor. Hualo Prison, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. We all call it the Hanoi Hilton on this side of the Pacific Ocean. This was a French colonial construction. Now you know that we inherited this war from the French. And the history is complex. But to some of the men there, it was relatively simple. They had fought the French to get rid of them, and they were going to continue that fight. In fact, one of the officers, one NVA officer at the camp, had once been an inmate at the camp. The Hualo prison was a French colonial construction where dissidents and revolutionaries, among others, had been confined. Sometimes 2,000 at a time, in ridiculously and disgustingly overcrowded and cruel conditions. Today, by the way, you can visit the museum there. The Maison Centrale, there's the words on the front of it. And the museum guides there will tell you all about the French colonial history of the prison. And they won't talk about the years in which it was used for the torture and abuse of captured Americans, particularly because Americans are probably their greatest source of tourists. Yellow stucco walls surround it, over 15 feet high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire. This was the structure that was sort of considered the Hanoi Hilton proper. Now, as you read more about this, and I hope you do, any history talk like this is really just a commercial for good history books. You'll find that there were various structures that are scattered about the city and lumped under that Hanoi Hilton rubric. So most of them are best known in the written sources we have by American POW nicknames for them. And nicknames were a part of the culture of resistance. So you had the zoo and the zoo annex, and Alcatraz, which was where the biggest troublemakers in the top of the chain of command of POWs were sent to try to disrupt the prisoner's own internal organization. You also had the nicknames for the staff, generally based on personality or least flattering physical characteristic. And these were usually animal nicknames. You had cat and fox, the interrogators, eagle and owl. One of the guards referred to as hawk, seems to have been despised a little less than some of the others. Pig Eye, the chief and most skillful torturer, was probably despised the most of all. But the struggle would be between people who apparently have no resources at all and an enemy which apparently is holding all of the cards. It turns out there are some limiting factors that the North Vietnamese are dealing with because they are trying to develop propaganda assets. They have to attempt to keep most of the prisoners alive. And eventually this is figured out. They want to maintain plausible deniability of maltreatment. Now, nobody reading a communist propaganda account of anything is going to believe it. Well, I shouldn't say that. Clearly, a lot of people actually did. But they almost had to want to believe it. But there's limits. There's a certain distance that you can't go and still maintain that that's plausible at all. But their tools included brutal torture, starvation and dehydration, withholding medical care, and that is common to so many of these stories in this horrible hot jungle climate filled with parasites and fungus and all the other nasty things. You've got people with open wounds and broken limbs who are told that their political cooperation is a prerequisite for getting their medical care. And this is going to be a consistent pattern. Isolation is going to be a tool that doesn't leave any marks and is widely, that is a consistent feature. Sometimes they would try to work on a presumed psychological quirk. And I grabbed a lighthearted story when I could find one. There's not a lot in these accounts. Usually any account that has an aspect of humor to it winds up with everybody being tortured and beaten for their participation in the resistance. But in this case, the NVA just having studied, they thought they understood something about Americans, and it didn't work out. Porter Haleyburton was a naval officer and a Southerner, and they knew this. And so, after a session of beating and abuse, he was told that now he was going to be sent to the worst place of all and given the worst torture. And he was pushed into a cell with an Air Force major who was also a POW, who was black. And the NVA assumed that any American from the South, a white American from the South, would absolutely melt down at this prospect, and that this would be the worst torture. Porter quipped, "It was kind of torture to be stuck in there with an Air Force guy." But the torture was real. Sam Johnson, who later became a Texas congressman, recalled, and I tried to keep graphic accounts minimal. You can read them yourself, and you can certainly contemplate the art in... Cool. All right, I'll hurry, thank you. In John McGrath's 6 Years a Prisoner of War, his art, I think, is very effective, very accurate, very affecting, and many museums that have done exhibits on the Hanoi Hilton have relied on his book. By the way, I also recommend the PBS website American Experience summaries to learn more about this. Sam Johnson described the ropes. As a POW in the Hanoi Hilton, I could recall nothing from military survival training that explained the use of a meat hook suspended from the ceiling. It would hang above you in the torture room like a sadistic tease. You couldn't drag your gaze from it. During a routine torture session with the hook, the Vietnamese tied a prisoner's hands and feet, then bound his hands to his ankles, sometimes behind the back, sometimes in front. The ropes were tightened to the point you couldn't breathe. Then, bowed or bent in half, the prisoner was hoisted up onto the rope hook to hang by the ropes. Guards would return at intervals to tighten them until all feeling was gone, and the prisoner's limbs turned purple and swelled to twice their normal size. This would go on for hours, sometimes even days on end. Meanwhile, of course, the press is putting out notes, or the Vietnamese propaganda is putting out press stories that say that the prisoners are being well treated. And a big part of breaking them down is to keep any contact between the POWs, to put barriers in between communication between the POWs. One of the most famous ways to resist this at this point, fortunately it was not famous then, and my understanding is that the Vietnamese never broke it, was something called the TAP code. Have you all heard of this?
Yes.
The TAP code, prisoners learned it from different sources. But what the TAP code was a, we don't have an illustration of it, do we? There are 26 letters in the alphabet. You took a grid, 5 by 5 gives you 25 spaces, so the letters C and K were combined. And then with taps on the stone wall, that's not good for a tap code, is it? With taps on the stone wall, you selected the row and column of the letter that you were trying to communicate. Now you can imagine this is a pretty laborious process. And the original code, everybody knew Morse code. That was pretty standard training for air crew, and really anybody else. Any Boy Scout knew Morse code. But the TAP code, first of all, the enemy didn't know it, and it became rather quick and efficient, and was delivered in many different ways, sometimes with the sweeps of a broom, sometimes blocking a tiny light beam with your hand and using it as a sort of a flash code. In Alcatraz, it was done at times with coughs and sneezes of prisoners pretending to be ill. Captain Smitty Harris of the Air Force had learned this code from a Korean War POW survivor at survival school in the military, but not as part of the curriculum. It was discussed on a coffee break. Others learned it from carvings on the bottom of a table in the interrogation room. So you're laying on the floor having been beaten and you saw this thing above you. Others learned it from someone scratching it in the latrine. Jim Walker said he already knew this code from Arthur Kessler's novel, Darkness at Noon, about the Soviet gulags. Stockdale would also use a reference to this 1940 novel, by the way, when he was permitted to write a letter to his wife, but it couldn't reveal anything about actual mistreatment. He talked about that it was colder in the winter than in Hanoi than you would think, and that there was darkness, even at noon. A bit of nonsense that his wife immediately recognized as a reference to this novel about torture. The other famous way in which this mistreatment was passed on to the world was Jeremiah Denton, after an extended torture session, and he had been prepped in every way to do an interview with foreign reporters. And he had been given the scripted answers, which he did not stick to, but he did not deviate too far from the scripted answers. Instead, he concentrated on Morse code, with which he blinked the word torture during the interview itself, which was something his own wife and family did not pick up when they were watching the footage, but that the intelligence people shortly afterwards did. So, how much time have I got?
You've got 14 minutes till.
A commercial for good history books. Remember that, because there is so much to read and learn about this. And so many little stories that need to be covered. The uniform on display of Stockdale here reflects his receipt of the Medal of Honor as a POW. The uniform of J. Quincy Collins, Citadel graduate, the one referred to as the clown suit. Collins wrote a book afterwards, too. And Jim Warner, although this story is not in the book, Jim Warner told a story on him. He said Quincy was a musician, writes Judy Warner, Jim's wife. He organized choirs and wrote songs in prison. That is in the book. The camp officers asked him to put American words to revolutionary songs. They want to create propaganda. Quincy told them he would have to change some things so Americans would understand them. Then he rewrote the words to the song so that every line was a double entendre. He made the communist propaganda song into one long, extremely dirty joke. Now, a pious Baptist today, this does not appear in his own book, I'm telling on him. But the prisoners agreed that they would sing this song and record it, and it was played on Hanoi radio. Now, of course, this is one of those times to resist that everybody knows from the beginning. This is going to crash down on everybody. There will be brutal punishment for all when this is done. But go for it. This is worth it. And later on, an NVA officer who loved the propaganda song told Quincy he was very angry at him because of what you wrote. My friend is no more. Well, there were other ways to resist, but the primary one, from what I've read, was to keep communication with your comrades, to give them support, to help them, to maintain the American chain of command as much as possible. And the communists knew this was something important to break, so they assigned a prisoner in each room. Once there was more than one prisoner per room. And I'm sorry, I haven't gone through the timeline of how this changed over time. But one prisoner per room was supposed to be the spokesman and the appointed guy according to the camp. And it was not according to the American chain of command. That was one more thing that the Americans would defy. But defiance was limited. There was no recourse against the physical and psychological torture. There is no room to deviate. Policy can cause disaster. In World War II, it was frequently noted Japanese prisoners of war were rare because you don't get captured. But those who did very frequently collaborated. Why? Because the disgrace of being a POW at all to them was so intense that they thought they had nothing to go back to and nothing to live for. Instead, the American code was, make them work for it next time too. And the communists are not primarily torturing them for militarily useful information, but simply to make them say something beyond the Big Four code so that they can use that in some form of propaganda, but also with the prisoner's own guilt and shame at having said something beyond the Big Four. They're going to try to make that a wedge and expand it. The idea that what you do is understand that everybody breaks, and understand you can make them do it all over again. Well, that takes an enormous amount of physical and moral courage, maybe more than an all or nothing plan, but it is what they carried out. So much that I don't have time for, and I really encourage you, although it's dark history, to immerse yourself in the story of these guys, because I said before that the North Vietnam won the media war. They did not win this battle. Apparently helpless American POWs maintained their communication with each other, their morale, their mutual support, and remembering what had happened in Korea, dedicated themselves to remembering everything they could about everybody else that they learned was there, so there would be full accountability. Back home, a home front battle was going on too. And there have been at least 2 really good books about the League of Wives, something that was originally started by Mrs. Stockdale. The families of prisoners were originally given a policy not to talk to the press or anybody else and to keep everything quiet. They too were limited to the big 4. Don't say anything beyond. Sybil Stockdale wrote, "I felt somewhat reassured remembering in the briefing about guidelines if your husband was taken prisoner, the commander had said our government believed the men being held were well treated. If I kept quiet, the Navy felt the communists would continue to treat the men in a humane and civilized way. I felt sure the government had good reason to insist on this keep quiet policy." Well, she came to a realization that this was not the wisest course, and she became quite a trouble causer. From later in her same memoirs, "What we need is a national organization," she told a fellow wife, "to attract national publicity. We already have a national group with all our people all over the country writing to editorial writers and sending telegrams to the North Vietnamese. Why don't we call ourselves the National League of Families of American Prisoners in Southeast Asia? I'll offer to be the national coordinator. Maybe this will help get more publicity for our men." Later, one official in the Defense Department told me they knew they'd better join us or we were going to mop up the floor with them. That was exactly what I wanted them to feel. Well, this league, the ultimate mark perhaps of success of this league, the POWs were not the only ones who came face to face with the enemy. Stockdale's wife led a group of wives all the way to Paris to the Vietnamese embassy, got an appointment, went in there and shooed them out. They told her, "We know all about you, Mrs. Stockdale. We know you're the founder of the movement. We think you should direct your questions to your own government." Then they responded with a group of their own, the Committee of Liaison with Families of Servicemen Detained in Vietnam, led by a far-left activist who was working with them. But this turned out to be a useful organization because it became the front for allowing postcards to be sent back and forth, which was a huge change in communication back and forth. So although the communists insisted that correspondence go through this friendly to them group, nevertheless, correspondence happened. So many other stories. When you get access to YouTube again, look for an animated short called The Incredibly Stupid One. It is about a prisoner whose personal strategy for dealing with the NBA was to pretend to be an idiot. And this sailor apparently managed some good service to his comrades in arms in the course of this facade. In 1973, Operation Homecoming happened. This is a victory in a lost war. What was feared that when the term that Nixon was using was Americanization, or Vietnamization of the war. American withdrawal and leaving the South Vietnamese hopefully in a position to successfully defend their own country. Well, the fear was that our POWs would disappear in this process. This did not happen, and a big reason it did not happen was the efforts of that League of Civilians at home, wives and family of the POWs, and the POWs' dedication to maintaining accountability and maintaining to the part of the code that says we don't accept special favors, we're not going to go home in drips and drabs, everybody sticks together and looks out for each other. So, 591 prisoners would return through Operation Homecoming in 1973. As many as 114 Americans died in Vietnamese captivity, although I can't tell you how many were part of the Hanoi Hilton system. Lessons. We talk about lessons of history, and I said I was going to be bold enough to draw a few, and I've got people in the room who can correct me. But I'm going to suggest these from the Hanoi Hilton experience. North Vietnam won the war, but they lost the campaign in the POW camps, even though they had every apparent advantage to repeat what the North Koreans had done to our POWs. Better informed this time, and with heroic, shrewd resistance and support on the home front, that effort failed. Now, when you don't have any advantages and you're being bullied, I suggest remind yourself who you are and what your central values are. And that was a constant through the chain of command in the Hanoi Hilton. The NVA are trying to establish a new identity for these men, whom they always refer to as war criminals. That's the excuse for not following the Geneva Convention, which North Vietnam had signed. Well, yeah, that's for prisoners of war, but these are not prisoners of war. They never declared a war. These are war criminals. Remind yourself who you are and what your central values are. The code formalized that. Do what it takes to communicate with your brothers in arms, whoever those are in your life. Do what it takes to keep the communication open. Risks, penalties, sacrifices. Lose the communication. Become isolated. And that's a loss. You can be broken. And it isn't the end. When you're driven beyond your endurance, you're driven beyond your endurance. When you recover, you can resume efforts. The power of faith is strongly advocated in many of these accounts. Some pious Roman Catholics, some solid Protestants. I haven't seen examples of other faiths among the accounts. But boy, they hung on to it and talked about it afterwards. Also the power of music and humor and any creative endeavor you can manage. Finally, if anybody but the good Lord is going to pull you out of the deepest, darkest hole there can be, it's going to be your wife. If anybody is going to cut through bureaucracy, it's going to be a group of angry women with the mama bear instinct activated. I think those are all fair lessons of history. And I'll wind up with the sort of the goofiest image I found. But the first time the Hanoi Hilton story landed on my radar screen I talked about a comparison to comic book heroes. Evangelical kid in the early 70s. I had a copy of this. I probably spent my own 49 cents for it. Very cartoonish, and this is Howard Rutledge's story. And of course, in the picture we have the bestial-looking enemy, and an oversimplification of how interrogations were dealt with. But this was my introduction to the Hanoi Hilton, and is among the many accounts that can be read today, although I would think perhaps not the single most accurate one. I have a last, we're past one, and you all have hung with me. I appreciate it. I'm still on the clock. But we really appreciate your spending the time with us today, and I particularly would like to ruthlessly call attention to a guest of honor today. This is a Silver Star citation. The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, July 9, 1918, takes pleasure in presenting the Silver Star to Captain Wallace Grant Newcomb, United States Air Force, for gallantry and intrepidity in action in connection with military operations against an opposing armed force in May 1969 while held prisoner of war in Vietnam. After a planned escape from the zoo camp, the enemy launched a massive torture purge, attempting to gain prisoner secrets and propaganda materials. Tortured well beyond the normal threshold of pain, Captain Newcomb continued to resist the enemy. By his gallantry and devotion to duty, Captain Newcomb has reflected great credit upon himself and the United States Air Force. On behalf of everybody who couldn't be here to be pointed out today, and I don't mean to be obnoxious about it, but Captain Newcomb, could you stand up for a moment? And I'm sorry, no longer Captain, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Newcomb. Thank you so much for hearing my inadequate attempt today. And Jim Warner says hi.
Oh, no, I have to tell a story. I'm Jim Warner. Oh, yeah. Can everybody hear me?
About 2 seconds.
Okay, I guess this thing works. First time I met Jim, he said, I have terminal diseases. You have to know this. I said, Jim, what do you mean by you have terminal diseases? He said, well, from time to time, I self-diagnose, and I figure out that I'm dying. I said, oh, that's interesting. Well, in the long run, this provides some amusement because about every 2 months he had a terminal disease, and he'd say, oh, I have this, that, the other thing. And Chris would just laugh at him. And it was funny to us, and he'd be annoyed for a couple of hours. The kind of crazy person, I'm going to tell a story of him, Jerry Venanzi. He'd run around, he was pretending he was riding a bicycle. And the Vietnamese, they didn't bother him about this. But they would pull us into interrogation and say, what about this Venanzi? Is he all right? And we'd say, gee, we aren't sure. We also have serious doubts about it. There's one other thing. Passing the time. It's one of these things where hours become days, become months, become years, and there's no end in sight. And one of the ways we dealt with this when we were put in big rooms in the Hanoi Hilton, was following the pretty darn Sante, who tried to have a rescue. And at any rate, they moved us all back into Hanoi in these big rooms. And the Vietnamese really couldn't keep track of us. There were too many people in the room and one little peephole. One of the things we do for recreation is have on Sundays when the guards didn't bother us too much. We had a program. One of the things is somebody said, let's have a debate. I thought this is an acceptable time to talk about debates. And one of the things that came up was the question of veracity. We didn't have any encyclopedia, because there's no way to check on truth. So we came up with a hand-only rule. If somebody made a statement and it went by for 15 seconds and there's no challenge, it became a fact. And hence the term Hanoi fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's humbling to be around people like Wally and actually to dare to stand up and tell part of their story in front of them. Wade Hampton doesn't come back and correct me. Thank you for your grace today. And I hope your story keeps being told and gets told better. Thank you.
Thank y'all for being here. We are going to have another off-site program like this in August. Not sure the exact date or the exact location, but if you would please, if you'd like to attend, make sure we have your name and email address. Those of you who are regulars have probably signed in before. We've had several people be kind enough to sign in today. If y'all could do that before you leave, it's right by the door there. Thank you very much.